Nick Page, in his good-humoured and helpful summary of the story of the Bible called The Big Story, has an interval about two-thirds of the way through. In it, he says this: at which point we reach the end of the Old Testament. There will now be an interval of around 400 years. During this time, Israel will be conquered by the Greek Empire and will then rebel and have around 100 years of independence before being conquered by the Romans. The synagogue system will be developed. The family of Herod will assume the Jewish throne, and a range of ice creams and chalk ices will be served. A voice in the wilderness will be heard 15 minutes before the advent of the Messiah. If you want an ice cream, now would be the time to go and fetch one. They're in the freezer, second shelf down. Help yourself. Back to our Bible study. At which point, I have to confess, there won't be much Bible study as such this evening, or indeed for the rest of our Thursday classes in May. We've reached the point where the Bible falls silent. The Old Testament story has drawn to a close. Many of the descendants of those taken captive to Babylon have been allowed to return to Judah and rebuild both the city of Jerusalem and its temple under permission granted by Shah Cyrus the Great of Persia. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah have given encouragement. The story is told in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And a little later, the story of Queen Esther tells how God made sure his people in the Persian Empire were protected, thanks to the bravery of a good Jewish girl named Hadassah, who quite remarkably had become Queen Esther of Persia. Hurrah! At just the right time to thwart the nefarious plans of Haman the Agagite. Boom! There are some prophecies that look to their future in what we, from our perspective, can call the time between the Testaments. Isaiah told how Cyrus would one day shepherd God's people. Daniel saw strange visions that may well refer to this period and which we will look at in greater detail next week, Lord willing. And Daniel's explanation of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a multi-tiered statue will be relevant to what we're looking at this evening. But as for actual Bible study with book, chapter and verse, I'm afraid that from Malachi to Matthew, we have next to nothing. And yet a lot happens. The Old Testament closes with Persia as the dominant power. The New Testament opens with Rome in control. The Old Testament closes with Aramaic being the local language of choice. The New opens with Greek being the dominant language around the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. The Old Testament closes with the temple in Jerusalem. It is still there in the New, greatly expanded and embellished thanks to King Herod, but the majority of Jews now worship in synagogues. In both Old and New Testaments, there are Jewish priests and, towards the end of the Old Testament, scribes as well. We meet both groups in the New Testament, where we also find Pharisees and Sadducees. And in the time between the Testaments, there are also Essenes and the writers of the documents we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, who may or may not be the same group of people. So the time between the Testaments is a time of change. And the catalyst is an unlikely king of what was considered to be a wild and somewhat backwards little kingdom to the north of Greece. Enter Alexander of Macedon. In some ways, Alexander straddles the genres of history and hagiography. History being the orderly record of events in the past, hagiography being literally writing, graphe, about saints, hagioi, holy ones. So a hagiography, while based on historical facts, can sometimes inflate the virtues of the subject while looking the other way at his or her failings. Many of the contemporary sources on Alexander are uncritical and make him out to be greater than perhaps he was. But at a distance of more than 2,000 years, we can only be certain of our uncertainties. One dubious source is the Greek Alexander Romance. This was written or compiled sometime in the 3rd or 2nd century before Christ, so well beyond the living memory of anyone who knew Alexander personally. He died in 323 BC, by the way. The author of the romance is unknown. It is a fantastical biography, for us an unusual genre. In it, Alexander is the illegitimate son of a seductive sorcerer. He travels by air in a basket carried by eagles and visits the ocean floor in a diving bell, and his daughter turns into a mermaid. The romance was rewritten and translated throughout antiquity, and some stories made their way into the Quran. If you're interested, a translation of the romance by Richard Stoneman was published by Penguin Classics in 1991. You do not need to read it, but it's there if this is something that intrigues you. A more credible contemporary source for at least some aspects of Alexander's life and thought are lecture notes written by his tutor, Aristotle. Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BC and thus was born before Alexander and outlived him. His father had been court physician to King Amyntas of Macedon. Aged 17, Aristotle travelled south to study at Plato's Academy in Athens and stayed there for 20 years. When Plato died, Aristotle hoped and expected to succeed him. But when someone else was chosen, Aristotle returned to Macedon to become tutor to the young Alexander and his companions. When Alexander became king, Aristotle returned to Athens, where he established his own school, the Lyceum. Like Plato, Aristotle wrote dialogues as a way of showing different sides of an argument, but most of these were lost. However, much of his work survived in the form of lecture notes, covering a wide variety of subjects from drama to zoology, with much information supplied from Alexander, who made sure reports were sent back to his former tutor from the many places Alexander visited. Aristotle's work has been mined by Alexander's scholars to expand our understanding of the king. Probably the most important text to help us understand Alexander and his own conception of greatness is the cornerstone of European literature, the Iliad by Homer. The story covers 10 days in the 10th and final year of the siege of Troy. Achilles, the greatest warrior in the Greek army, has refused to fight after the High King Agamemnon confiscated his favourite slave girl. However, the death of his closest friend, Patroclus, prompted Achilles to think again. He rejoins the fight and kills Hector, the king of Troy's son, and the tide finally turns in the Greeks' favour. No one knows who Homer was. He seems to have lived around the years 750 to 700 BC and may have been a blind slave from Ionia, or a Babylonian hostage, or a Sicilian princess. The princess idea was dreamt up by the poet and translator Robert Graves for his novel Homer's Daughter, and it's not the most likely option on the list, but does remind us of the fact that no one really knows much about Homer at all. Some scholars wonder if Homer is a collective term for an oral storytelling tradition, in which case the most famous Homer of all must be Mr. Simpson of Springfield, USA. Oh. It's not an understatement to say that the Iliad was Alexander's guide to how a warrior conducts himself as it explores the themes of vengeance, compassion, and courage under adversity. While we do not need to read the Iliad or its sequel, the Odyssey, the Iliad remains both the first and, in many ways, still the best war story ever told. If we are truly to understand the mind of Alexander and other ancient kings and conquerors, we need to know the Iliad, or at least know about it. There are many translations and retellings of the story. If you just want the story, then my recommendation is Rosemary Sutcliffe's Black Ships Before Troy. And if you can find the edition illustrated by Alan Lee, you're in for a double treat. Well, I find Alexander one of the most interesting historical characters who's ever lived. For the purposes of this class, we're more interested in the impact his life had on God's chosen people. Alexander was born in 356 BC, a son and potential heir of King Philip II of Macedon and Olympias, one of his several wives. Philip was engaged in a long-standing attempt to unite the independent city-states to the south under his overlordship, with a view to combining to liberate the Greek cities on the Asian coast from Persian domination. Once diplomacy had failed, Philip used force and, with Alexander at his side, inflicted a crushing defeat on the southern states led by Athens and Thebes in the valley of Chaeronea in the year 338. Philip was assassinated in 336, with Alexander being proclaimed as king. Some suggest that the two events were connected, but with Philip dead, Alexander was forced either to claim the throne of Macedon or to flee. The southern cities rebelled, but Alexander crushed all opposition, so that when he was ready to cross the Hellespont into Asia, he was confident that his regent back in Macedon, Antipater, would have no further problems. Early in 334, Alexander commenced his father's war of revenge. He had some 43,000 infantry and 5,500 cavalry under his command, with the elite Macedonians giving the army its backbone. They were armed with a 6-meter-long pike known as a sarissa, which was at the cutting edge of military technology. The Persians had no answer. That same year, 334, saw Alexander's first great victory over the Persian satraps of Asia Minor. This was the Battle of Granicus, and having routed the enemy, Alexander was able to take the cities of Sardis, Ephesus, and Miletus. At this point, I remind you of how useful a good Bible atlas can be in tracing the campaign, but if you don't have one to hand, just go with the flow. Hopefully you recognize Ephesus from your New Testament reading, same place. Alexander's maneuvers across Asia Minor were threatened by the Persian navy that was still at large on the Mediterranean Sea. Typically, he took the chance of heading inland and got lucky when the Persian admiral fell ill and died. Having moved through Lycia, Pamphylia, and Phrygia, Alexander turned south and lured the much larger Persian army into the narrow coastal strip south of Issus. This meant that there was no space for the Persian weight of numbers to be effectively deployed, and the initial Macedonian cavalry charge induced the entire Persian army to retreat. This victory in November 333 opened up both Mesopotamia to the east and the coastal route south towards Egypt. Alexander moved south, taking Tyre and Gaza after lengthy sieges and accepting Egypt's surrender at the end of the year. Heading north once more, Alexander crossed into Mesopotamia and finally brought the Persian Shah, Darius, to battle at Gaugamela on the 1st of October 331. Once again, the Macedonian cavalry outmaneuvered the Persians and the victory was emphatic. Babylon and Susa fell soon after, and Alexander headed into the Persian heartlands, occupying Persia in the winter of 331 to 330 and looting Persepolis. Darius was now a beaten man and withdrew from his last remaining stronghold, Ecbatana, in the summer of 330, only to be assassinated by his general Bessus, who withdrew to his own satrapy of Bactria and declared himself king under the name of Artaxerxes V. It took Alexander some time to mop up the eastern end of what had been the Persian Empire, and then he led his army in an audacious crossing of the Hindu Kush into what today we call Pakistan. However, Alexander's veterans had had enough and refused to go any further east. So in November 325, the army started the march back west. He may have been planning further campaigns, perhaps into Arabia, perhaps across the Adriatic Sea into Italy. But Alexander, conqueror of the Persian Empire, died in Babylon on the 10th of June 323 BC, aged 33. He must have been weakened by the many wounds he received after years of campaigning, but contemporary witnesses thought he'd been poisoned. However, the symptoms, at least so far as we can grasp them at this distance, suggest he may have caught typhoid, either from drinking contaminated water or perhaps bathing in the river Euphrates. Whatever the cause, Alexander died and his empire did not long outlast him. If you wish to fill in some of the many blanks I've left, there are many places to look, probably too many. For example, I searched for, quote, Alexander the Great on the Waterstones website, Waterstones being the largest UK book chain, and received more than 1,100 suggestions. I expect some are worth a look, and I'm sure plenty are not. So here's a useful Latin phrase, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. If you have a local library, you should find something about Alexander in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. There's a lengthy entry by Albert Bryan Bosworth in the Oxford Classical Dictionary. It is under Alexander III, by the way. Or if you can get to the British Bible School Library, currently housed in the Northampton Congregation's meeting place, you could look in one of the various Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias kept there. The article by J.E.H. Thompson in the first volume of the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia is one example from many. Of course, an interweb search generates more information than I can process, from books and websites through to holiday tours. If you prefer searching online, you'll have to make your own choices and use your existing knowledge to filter out the fantasy. For example, in recent years, there's been a heated debate over whether Alexander was Greek, Macedonian, or Serbian, an argument that is rooted in the contemporary issue as to whether the former Yugoslavian state, now known as North Macedonia, is the legitimate successor to Alexander's Macedonia? Many Greeks would say not, and the argument seems to me to have generated more heat than light. Another useful Latin phrase is caveat lector, let the reader beware. Given that Alexander was a warrior king who always led from the front, following the example of his hero Achilles in the Iliad, the fact that he died young could not have been unexpected. What is surprising is that there were no plans for the succession. Alexander left two wives, Roxana, a Bactrian princess, and Barsine, daughter of Shah Darius. Both were pregnant, and if either of the babies were a boy, then he would be heir. But until the hypothetical boy reached maturity, a plan B was required. Alexander's closest and most trusted friend, Hephaestion, the Patroclus to Alexander's Achilles, had predeceased him, dying of a fever in Ecbatana. None of Alexander's remaining companions stood out from the rest. According to the later historian Arrian, when Alexander was asked who should be king after him, he replied, Hoti to kratisto, to the strongest. Perhaps Alexander was assuming that both children were going to be boys, and the strongest would become king. Perhaps Alexander was being more cynical. He assumed the remaining Macedonian generals would soon be squabbling over who should be regent until the boys, if they were indeed boys, were old enough. But did Alexander actually say kratisto? Given that he was dying and presumably was not speaking clearly, might Alexander have said kratero, not kratisto? Craterus had already been appointed as regent of Macedon, meaning that Alexander trusted him and thought him capable of standing up to Alexander's formidable mother, Olympias, the widow of King Philip. If that had been Alexander's hope, then he had to trust that those generals who were with him in Babylon could be trusted to deliver the news to Craterus back in Macedon. Some hope. The generals quickly agreed that it was unthinkable for the throne to go to anyone not of Alexander's blood, which excluded Craterus and indeed all the generals. Someone remembered that Alexander had an older half-brother named Philip Aridaeus. He was not the sharpest sword in the armory, but he was undoubtedly a son of King Philip, and so therefore acceptable. No doubt all the generals believed that they would be able to persuade Aridaeus to do as he was advised. While the generals intrigued, Roxana acted. She forged a letter to Alexander's other wife, asking her to visit in Babylon. When Barsine arrived, Roxana had her and the child she was carrying killed, leaving only Roxana's baby as heir. A son was indeed born and named as Alexander IV. He reached the age of 13, so just about old enough to be considered suitable to reign in his own right, when Cassander murdered him and his mother. We know nothing whatsoever about this Alexander's appearance or character, or whether he would have made a capable king. Now the power struggle could begin in earnest. It is at this point that we should remind ourselves of Nebuchadnezzar's dream about a statue from Daniel chapter 2. This statue has 4 tiers, sort of a metallic layer cake, or not. Anyway, the golden head represented Nebuchadnezzar's own kingdom of Babylon. This was to be followed in the future, from Daniel's perspective, by a silver kingdom. This must be the Medes and the Persians that conquered Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar had died, but while Daniel was still living. Then comes the Bronze Kingdom, not the Bronze Age, a Bronze Kingdom. Bronze is an amalgam of copper and tin, and Alexander's kingdom was comprised of Greeks and Macedonians. So this is tonight's class. Coming soon is the Fourth Kingdom, which we'll talk about later in this series. If you know any ancient history, you probably know where this is heading. So Alexander's conquests were not a surprise to God, and any disciples of Daniel that were familiar with the book that bears his name may also have been able to decode the dream, at least to this point. I very much doubt if anyone alive at the time of Alexander's death would have had any idea about the identity of the next great kingdom. But God knows, of course. An unforeseen consequence of Alexander's conquests was what is now called Hellenism. This was the way that the conquered peoples across much of the ancient Near and Middle East adopted Greek language and culture. This was not imposed by Alexander or his army, or at least not directly. There was no unit of the army tasked with Hellenizing the conquered people at the point of a spear. This was not like the Nazi German policy of forcible Aryanization of Europe, with the SS weeding out those that failed to meet Nazi standards and sending them to the death camps. Hellenization was more akin to what happened after the Second World War, when many different people from around the world decided they wanted to wear Levi jeans, drive a Jeep, and watch Hollywood movies while drinking Coca-Cola. The process called Americanization, or more cynically, Coca-Cola colonialism. Other cola drinks are available, also made in America. Of course, the Macedonians did not drink Coca-Cola. They did not even speak English. Shocking, I know. Although we could describe the Greek language in the ancient world, or at least the world around the Mediterranean, as being like English in that it seemed to be everyone's second language. And this has a huge impact on the New Testament. It was written in the 1st century after Christ, Anno Domini in Latin, not in Hebrew, which was almost a dead language by this point, nor in Aramaic, the language that Jesus probably spoke, but by then a local language, and not Latin, which was used in Rome and the western end of Rome's empire. Greek was the closest thing to a universal language in the parts of the Roman Empire to the east of Rome and across much of non-Roman Mesopotamia. This ubiquity is in part because Greek was a flexible and fluid language with an easy-to-use alphabet, much easier than Egyptian hieroglyphs, for example. And Greek had a long history of literature, much of it written to be performed. People enjoyed hearing the stories of the Trojan War in the Iliad and the adventures of Odysseus on his way home from Troy in the Odyssey. Aesop's fables were proverbial. The philosophy of Socrates, as recorded by Plato, Aristotle, and many others, shaped the way the world was understood. Herodotus and Thucydides had invented the recording of history, and both told stories that people wanted to hear. And Greek drama was popular, and the works of Aeschylus, Aristophanes, Euripides, Sophocles, and others are still performed today. Greek as a language is one of the many Indo-European languages that include Celtic, Italic, Germanic, Indo-Iranian, Slavic, and others. In the time before Alexander, the dominant form of Greek was the language of Athens, Attic. But there were other forms of Greek spoken in different locations, such as Doric to the south, Macedonian to the north, and others. Attic was considered to be the most useful, partly because Athens was often the dominant city, and also because many of the great writers I mentioned a moment ago were Athenian. Once Macedonia became the dominant power in the Greek-speaking world, it became useful for everyone to speak the same dialect. Imagine an army officer giving orders in Macedonian that were not understood by a Spartan regiment. So Attic Greek became the dialect of choice, at least in public. What people spoke in their own homes is never going to be known, as they did not keep diaries. So the Greek that was taken east with Alexander's army was rooted in Athenian Attic, but was known as Koine, common Greek. Common as in shared, so common to all. And it is Koine Greek that is the Greek of the New Testament, sometimes used at a high level by Luke and whoever wrote Hebrews, and sometimes rather rough and ready, Greek as a second language, but still readily understood. Revelation is the least correct Greek in the New Testament, but that may be down to John being overwhelmed by what was revealed to him. A discussion for another day. I doubt that Alexander and his successors set out on their campaign against Persia with a view to making Koine Greek the language of empire. But it became the language of administration, so local non-Greek officials had to use it. And wherever Alexander's army marched, Greek traders were not far behind. So Koine became the language of commerce. As the campaign went on, Alexander encouraged his surviving veterans to remain in the empire once they retired, rather than returning to Macedon, where land was scarce. Given how wealthy these veterans were, they had no need to return to farming or fishing back in Greece. They could set up as men of property wherever they were discharged. Some married locals, others sent back to Macedon for their families to join them in the east. And these new Greek cities in exile formed a reliably loyal network of reservist soldiers who could be called out of retirement if needed. Many of the new settlements were named Alexandria. The most famous of all, Alexandria in Egypt, is still a major city today. Other Alexandrias survive, although how the name is pronounced means that unless you know, you might not recognize them. Kandahar in Afghanistan was an Alexandria, for example, and there are others. Once established in their new Greek city, the veterans made sure they enjoyed all the comforts of home. Much of what I've been saying in this talk could be classified as nice to know, rather than information we need to know, and what follows might be the same, except the features of a Macedonian town in exile were later used by the Romans, so when Paul and other Christian missionaries headed out with the gospel message, preached in Greek, remember, they followed Roman roads and visited towns that usually had many of the same features. Obviously, local topography played its part. A town on the coast or a major river would have a harbour and dock area, but the basic features were pretty much universal. Just as today a typical English village will have some of a parish church, a village hall, a pub, a primary school, possibly a village shop, maybe a post office, not forgetting the duck pond. A Macedonian town would have most of the following, including an agora, temples, a theatre, a gymnasium, and a hippodrome. Let us unpack some of the details and try to look for links with Luke's descriptions of Roman towns in Acts. As a rule of thumb, and there are exceptions, but by and large it holds true, the ancient Greeks tended to settle only where they could grow olive trees, and the Romans where they could grow vines, which immediately answers the question about why the Roman Empire was bigger than the Greek areas of settlement. And yes, the Romans could and did grow vines across Britannia, at least as far north as Iberacum, the city we call York. Europe was warmer back then. However, the point I want to make is that, by and large, the Greeks and later the Romans lived in parts of the world where it was warm and dry for a greater part of the year than we are used to in Great Britain today. So it was much easier for the Greeks and Romans to hold public meetings in the open air, as we often see in the New Testament. Indeed, in some parts of the world, then as now, too much sun was a problem for much of the year. So Roman theatres had canvas awnings to give shade, and around public squares were porticos, covered walkways, which would provide shelter when it rained, but were more often used to give shade from the full sun. The agora was the central public square in most Greek towns. The Roman equivalent of the Forum was not always so public, as the important political decisions were made indoors in the Senate, which was not a public building. Both the Agora and the later Forum could be busy, noisy, and potentially dangerous. Hence the use of the word today in agoraphobia, the fear, from the Greek phobos, the fear of unenclosed places. In practical terms, for many agoraphobics, it's the crowd rather than the space that's frightening. But agoraphobia is almost always an outdoors issue. The Greeks loved to talk, to discuss the latest news, to debate and argue. You might remember Paul's visit to Athens in Acts 17. Here's the passage in question from verse 16 in the English Standard Version. Now, while Paul was waiting for Silas and Timothy at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities," because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. The ESV says that Paul was reasoning with people in the synagogue and then the marketplace. Reasoning is dialogomai in Greek, dialoguing, if we can allow such an ugly word. And this dialoguing happened in the agora, the public square. There may well have been buying and selling in the agora. When I used to live in Milton Keynes, the shopping centre in Wolverton was, probably still is, called the Agora. But in ancient Greek, the Agora was also the public square for philosophical and political debates. By the time Paul reached Athens, the Romans had taken the political decisions out of the public square, but the Agora was still the place for public discussion on non-political matters. Wherever you went in the Greek or Roman world, you would find temples. This would include the temple built in honor of Yahweh in the city of Jerusalem, an impressive building, but never one of the wonders of the world. For the biggest and best of temples in the ancient world, you might visit the Pantheon in Rome, the home of all, Pan, the gods, Theon. And please understand that when I use the words gods and goddesses in this part of the talk, I write them without an initial capital G, and do not believe that they ever existed, unlike the one true God and his son Jesus. I think it would become tiresome to keep adding so-called every time I mentioned a Greek or Roman god, so-called. Other famous temples in the ancient world would include the Parthenon on the Acropolis at Athens, where Athena was worshipped. Athena's father Zeus was worshipped at Olympia, where a statue of the god made by the Athenian Phidias dominated the interior of the temple. On the middle day of the athletic competition held at Olympia every fourth year, the crowd would assemble outside the temple where a hecatomb of oxen, that's 100 in our money, would be slaughtered and burnt on the great altar. This statue sat enthroned at Olympia for more than 800 years, revered as one of the wonders of the world. But in AD 393, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I was persuaded by the Christian clergy to shut the temple and abolish the games. The statue was moved to Constantinople, where in 462 it was destroyed in a fire, and the temple at Olympia was abandoned and eventually fell into ruin. Another famous temple was that of Artemis in Ephesus, on the western coast of modern-day Turkey. Over the centuries, the temple was rebuilt several times, and by the 1st century was one of the must-see sites for wealthy pilgrims, or, if you prefer, tourists. When Paul visited the city, as recorded in Acts 19, the local silversmiths saw his preaching as an attack on their livelihood, as the market for miniature silver shrines dedicated to Artemis was threatened by worshippers turning to the one true God. The temple lasted until the year 262, when it was looted by invading Ostrogoths. So perhaps Artemis was not so great after all. As I said, every city, great or small, across the ancient world had its temple or temples to whichever was the god or goddess in favour at that location. Sometimes one of the famous Olympian deities, whether known by its Greek or Roman name, sometimes a local deity. The Greeks, as they marched across Western Asia behind Alexander, had a habit of identifying local gods with their own. So the warrior god of the Phoenicians, named Melkart, was seen to be the Greek Heracles under a different name, and we tend to know Heracles by his Latin name, Hercules. This merging of names is known as syncretism. It worked in most places until the Greeks met the Jews who worshipped an invisible god who forbade the making of statues and did not permit visiting dignitaries to sacrifice to him. More on this next week. In addition to the pantheon of the well-known, one could almost say universal deities, there were many and various local gods and goddesses. Almost every street corner would have its wayside shrine to some god or goddess. Every home would have a family shrine. These Greek cities were full of religion. Well, sort of. Perhaps you remember what Paul said in Athens. Acts 17 verses 22 and 23 in Eugene Peterson's interpretive paraphrase, The Message. So Paul took his stand in the open space at the Areopagus and laid it out for them. "'Tis plain to see that you Athenians take your religion seriously. When I arrived here the other day, I was fascinated with all the shrines I came across, and then I found one inscribed, 'To the God nobody knows.' I'm here to introduce you to this God so you can worship intelligently, know who you're dealing with. It's plain to see you Athenians take your religion seriously," is a nice way of putting it. but I wish we knew what tone of voice Paul was using. Sarcastic, ironic, matter of fact. The key word, here translated as religion, is deus daemon, with the roots deido meaning fear and daemon, demons or gods. It can mean superstitious, which of course means different things to different people, or it can have a more positive sense of reverence for the divine. The public face of Athens was one that took religion seriously, but only God knows how much any of the people really believed. Or was it just a superstitious lip service? I will leave that to God to decide. I expect most of us have a local theatre. Mine is the Waterside at Aylesbury, with its statue of the late Ronnie Barker outside. He made his professional debut in Aylesbury. Not a lot of people know that. But a typical 21st century European theatre is not the same as a Greek Odeon. And yes, Aylesbury has an Odeon cinema as well as a theatre. An ancient Greek and Roman theatre had a stage on which actors acted, and that is about as similar as they get to a modern theatre. In the ancient world, drama was almost a branch of religion. Plays were often dedicated to one of the gods, which would be a problem for Jews and later for Christians as well. And sometimes the content could be problematic. As Kitto says, some of the jokes in Aristophanes would make the stock exchange blush. So no, I'm not going to quote any. Probably the best known references to a theatre in the New Testament was when Paul was in Ephesus. We are in Acts 19, breaking into the story at verse 23. About that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades, and said, Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence. See, she whom all Asia and the world worship. When they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! So the city was filled with the confusion, and they rushed together into the theatre, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theatre. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they'd come together. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defence to the crowd. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they all cried out with one voice, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So the theatre in Ephesus doubled up as a public assembly space, probably because everybody could see and hear. But by and large, Jews and Christians avoided the theatre in the ancient world, partly because of drama's close association with pagan religion, and partly because of the often immoral content. Likewise, the Hippodrome. This was the home of horse racing for Macedonians and chariot racing for Romans. Both attracted gambling, and both could become dangerously rowdy if the popular favourite failed to win. By the time of the Roman Empire, the chariot racing factions could be as noisy and often as violent as the worst of modern football supporters. In general, Jews and Christians avoided the hippodrome. And the final building or public space found in the majority of ancient Greco-Roman cities was the gymnasium. Originally, the gymnasium was an open space where the citizen militia trained. Later, as the army became more professional and the soldiers trained in their camp rather than the public gymnasium, the city gymnasium became more of a public exercise area, particularly for young men who were not soldiers. Older men would gather to watch, and sometimes the gymnasium doubled up as a school of philosophy, until eventually the gymnasium became more like a school for teenagers with classrooms and teachers as well as trainers. In Greek cities, the gymnasium was mainly for the male citizens and their sons, so Jews were generally not welcome. So, to conclude, Alexander was a remarkable military commander. Had he lived longer and died with a recognized heir to succeed him, perhaps the history of the world may have been different. Whether better or worse, we can only speculate. But Alexander died in Babylon in the evening of the 28th day of the month of Dasius, or the 10th of June, 323 BC, in our terms, aged 32. His political legacy was a power struggle that split his empire and led to much conflict in and around the land of the Jews, as we shall see next week. Alexander's cultural legacy was the Hellenization of much of the ancient Near East, making the later Romanization much easier when a Roman warlord who styled himself as Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, in imitation of Alexander, conquered the lands around the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea and incorporated them within the Roman Empire, meaning that in the spring of the year 33, Jesus of Nazareth was sentenced to death on a Roman cross on the orders of a Roman procurator named Pontius Pilate. You probably knew that, but how Rome came to rule the world is a subject for a later class. Thank you.